Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Wayne Jennings. And I'm the host for today's discussion titled Frank Talk on Political Parties, Polarization, and the Future. We organize these forums as a congregational service to the community to support personal reflection, social action, and to encourage individual and collective growth for all of us here today. I'd now like to introduce the coordinator for today's forum, Susan Alcorn, the chair of our forum committee. She will introduce the topic and our speakers. Susan?
Thank you, Wayne. And I'm happy to be here today with everybody. It's a beautiful day. Daylight savings time has, I think, opened the door to a little more time than we normally have. So anyway, I just want to greet everyone and go over some of the issues that we'll be talking about. The results of Tuesday's election are fairly well known. Party divisiveness, polarization, all those things are still with us, I'm afraid. And it looks as if Congress and state governments will continue to have divisive parties and not much in the way of compromise. So we know that historically, the party that occupies the White House traditionally loses about 25 seats in midterm elections. That's normal. Gerrymandering is a deciding factor, as we know in many of these issues. Unaffiliated independent voters are also increasing. So I guess we should ask, can voters and their party affiliations really resolve these problems that we're facing? So those are some of the background issues we're dealing with. And I'd like to introduce our forum speakers. We are honored to have with us two excellent political science professors today. Professor Jonathan Entin of Case Western Reserve University and Professor Ryan Claassen of Kent State University. Professor Entin has been a law clerk for then Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the U.S. Court of Appeals. He's taught a wide variety of legal courses and published more than 100 articles, book chapters, essays, all of that during his 30-year tenure there at Case Western. Professor Claassen is widely published in many academic journals. He's the author of Godless Democrats and Pious Republicans and co-author of the Evangelical Crack-Up, the Future of the Evangelical Republican Coalition. Both professors have been widely interviewed extensively on so many local, national, even international programs, news programs, including the local NPR and NBC affiliates. So I'm sure we're going to have a good discussion here, and I want to turn it over to you, Ryan, as we get this discussion started. Okay? You're on mute.
It's only been 2 years, and I still
am
working on
all right.
myself.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. And let me share my screen, and I'll have a PowerPoint presentation to go with this. So as Jonathan and I conferred about what we would say today, we decided that our collective experiences were well honed to have sort of a general discussion about turnout and election administration. And so that is going to be sort of the area that I will focus on here. And, you know, as a political scientist, we are always interested in what's happening right now and the most recent election, but we're also especially interested as scientists in trying to think about very big general questions and some of the general implications of anything that's hot and new and current. So let's begin by just looking at a nice overview of turnout longitudinally. This is a graph that has in blue turnout rates in the presidential elections from basically the beginning of the presidential elections all the way up through 2016, I think is where the trend ends. although I did go ahead and pop the 2020 number in. If you're interested, it was 66.8 nationally, and Ohio was just a little bit higher than that. So, so that's the longitudinal trend in turnout. In terms of interesting variation in when more people vote versus when fewer people vote, this is probably one of the what Democratic theorists think is one of the most important prerogatives of citizenship, the right to cast a vote. And so on some levels, the United States, when it's compared to other industrialized democracies, has record low levels of turnout. A lot of people lament low levels of turnout and worry that some people are sort of ceding their voice by not participating. Other people worry, of course, that restrictiveness in our election administration is to blame for some of this. All of this is probably true. Just looking at some of the really big historical trends, of course, there's a huge uptick in participation around 1825 here. This is probably because of sort of the Jacksonian democracy, expansion of the franchise, and expansion of the connection between the mass electorate and how the presidents are chosen. So this is actually going to be sort of the countervailing trend. The subsequent two big changes are both downward changes and correspond with expansions of the electorate. Jacksonian democracy corresponded with expansion of the electorate beyond those that owned property. But also, as I mentioned, the presidency wasn't originally tied in any systematic way to how the popular vote went. And so I think that big uptick is largely explained by those two factors. And then we have sort of a downturn here as we get into the 1900s. And one sort of explanation for the downturn is the expansion of the right to vote to women, not necessarily because women won't vote at the same rate as men do, but when initially enfranchised, the hurdle is higher, just as voting rates are lower for young people and have always been lower for young people. The first election involves a couple of additional hurdles like registering to vote, figuring out where you're going to go, and all of those kind of things. And so initially, when women were given the right to vote, popular participation went down, and then it recovers. And then again, in the 70s, when 18-year-olds were given the right to vote, participation went down. And this is a group, though, the young people in our electorate that, like I said, are sort of always going to be in the position of voting for the first time. And so that expansion of the vote did not seem to correspond with a bounce back in the short term. The last thing that I'll say about this graph is that Michael McDonald has made a nice career for himself, sort of reinventing the way we think about the denominator in this fraction. Turnout is, of course, a fraction, the number of people that voted over the number of people that could have voted. And for a long time, political scientists were lamenting a recent downturn in participation. And Professor Michael McDonald pointed out that the denominator was sort of increasingly flawed as we used the percent of people, or I'm sorry, as we used the number of people over 18 as a denominator. And the reason it was increasingly flawed is because of incarceration rates and citizenship rates. So as citizenship rates went down and as incarceration rates went up, in conjunction with various felony disenfranchisement laws that exist in different states and different parts of the country, the population that was over the age of 18 sort of became an increasingly worse denominator. And so it looked like the downward trend was greater than it actually was. And if anything, sort of recent elections show a bit of an uptick in participation. So there might be a silver lining to some of the polarization that we routinely lament. Turning to the most recent election, the 2021 election, there isn't really a real solid number for what participation was LaRose did a press release and mentioned that absentee and early in-person balloting was running ahead of the similar rates in 2019. Estimates seem to put turnout from this last Tuesday at about 25%. Let's see if we go ahead a slide here. This is the sort of early numbers from the Cuyahoga Board of Elections, and turnout there was estimated about 25%, as you can see. One of the points that we might want to sort of make sure that we reflect on is the fact that these are very different groups. If we go back to this graph, you can see that the congressional election electors are a little different group than the presidential election electors, because the rate of turnout is a lot lower when there isn't a big and exciting race like the presidency on the ticket. And odd year elections, this is data from the Ohio Secretary of State. Odd year elections are even less interesting to voters and attract even lower participation. So this is, like I said, the data on odd-yeared elections in Ohio from the Secretary of State's website. And of note here, LaRose's denominator is even worse than the percent of voting age adults. So the denominator in this one is registered voters, and most registered voters do actually vote, but not everybody is registered to vote. So if we were to try to convert these numbers into numbers that are comparable with the 25% figure that people were estimating for 2021, and with Michael McDonald's figures, more generally, these would be roughly 10% on the high side. And you'll notice that it only goes through 2017. LaRose didn't put up the 2019 numbers. And I'm not entirely sure what the 2019 numbers would have looked like, but probably pretty similar to what 2021 was. I think he didn't put up 2019 because there wasn't any statewide issues on the ballot. Things bounce around a little bit because some of these odd year elections are more interesting than other ones. 2015, we had some really interesting legalization of marijuana statewide issues on the ballot. 2011, we had a referendum on a law that would have banned collective bargaining for government employees. So in years where there's something interesting on the ballot, turnout is higher. But generally speaking, these odd-yeared elections are a really small electorate, and just a fraction of the electorate that turns out to vote in presidential elections, which is just a fraction, only about 2/3 of all the people that would be eligible to turn out in those elections. So we could think, about what this means, whether the electorate that turns out for these kind of elections is representative of the public generally. We could think about what we could do to change these rates of turnout. Do we really need odd-yeared elections? They're expensive. They have a lot less participation than in other years. The sort of more that Americans could bundle their elections, the more they would save, the more efficient elections would work. And likely the more participation that we would have. Among other industrialized democracies, I mentioned that we have a notoriously low rate of turnout, but we also have a notoriously high number of elections. We ask folks to get out to the polls once or twice a year, which is in comparison to what other countries do, almost an obscenely high hope that people, you're putting a lot of, you're asking citizens to do a lot of work to carry out their democratic duty by voting when you have that many elections. So in terms of this question about parties and polarization, I thought I'd sort of transition from the general question about turnout to thinking about a more specific question. Well, which party benefits from higher turnout? And I've obviously got the conventional wisdom nailed down pretty good in the bullet points under this question. But I think each of us should think a little bit about this. Which party do we think benefits from higher turnout? And I think that Certainly the parties seem to believe the conventional wisdom. If I skip down a couple of bullet points here. This is a quote from my dissertation advisor, Benjamin Hyten. He wrote a 2017 annual review of political science article about the restrictive voter ID laws. And so the quote is, Republican Party control of state government appears to be a necessary condition for the adoption of strict photo ID laws. You know, it's if you're thinking about that as an effort to either expand or restrict the number of people that vote, it looks like the Republican Party seems to believe that the Democratic Party would benefit most from higher turnout. The Brennan Center did a report about the first part of 2021 in the wake of our very exciting 2020 presidential election. And there's been a lot of activity in the sphere of election administration, legislative activity. 19 states enacted 33 laws that make it harder for Americans to vote. You've got a couple of the examples down there that have been in the news a lot: Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Texas. These are, for the most part, all Republican-led states. So the parties seem to believe the conventional wisdom, and surveys show us that that voters do too. The belief seems almost unshakable. I've been working with a colleague at Stony Brook, fielding a couple of experiments where we try to where we introduce people by random variation to either vignettes that support the conventional wisdom or vignettes that oppose the conventional wisdom. And regardless of which kind of vignette survey respondents read, their belief in the conventional wisdom seems to be unshakable with predictable sort of implications. We won't spend a massive amount of time on this, but this is just sort of a list of some of these restrictive voting laws according to the Brennan Center, and gives you an idea of sort of the creativity of lawmakers as they think about election administration, shortening the window to apply for a mailed ballot, shortening the deadline to deliver mailed ballots, making it harder to remain on absentee voting lists, and so on and so forth. You know, obviously variations in voter ID requirements, purges of the voting list. So there's an almost limitless number of ways that that state legislatures and governors are making it more difficult to vote. Of course, that's not the way these kind of legislative initiatives are framed. They're framed around reducing fraud, and that's become an even more, I think, important and more politically salient way of thinking about this in the wake of challenges to the 2020 election results. So that's sort of the bad news. On the other hand, though, and I tend to be a fairly optimistic person and try to find some good news wherever it might exist. That same Brennan Center report also goes on to say that since 2020, 25 states have enacted 62 laws with provisions that expand voter access. This is more of a mix politically, but it's dominated by democratically led states. Just to give you a sort of a comparative list here of some of the ways in which states are being creative about making sort of extending the voter franchise, expanded early voting, making it easier to vote by mail, expanding the places where voters can drop their ballots, making voter registration easier, easing voter IDs. So, you know, it cuts in both directions, of course. Looking at something that the National Conference for State Legislatures prepared to just sort of boil this down into 6 quick policies and a real quick comparison of what's happening over time on each of these 6 policies from 2000 to 2020. This is the number of states that enacted each of these 6 policies, basically. So in 2000, we had 1 state, Oregon, that had an all-mail voting system. That's expanded up to 5 in 2020. And the vote by mail is becoming maybe one of the new and key battle lines in this, in the wake of the 2020 election, and with the ongoing pandemic. No excuse absentee voting, that expanded from 22 to 34. Ohio gets on that list in the 34. Early in-person voting expanded from 22 states to 43 states. Ohio's on that list as well. Restrictive voter ID laws were expanded from 13 states to 34 states. Ohio's on that list as well. So like I said, it's a bit of a mixed bag in some respects. A bit more of a mixed bag than that initial quote about it seeming that a Republican-led state legislature is a necessary condition. Necessary, but maybe not sufficient, especially when you look at the flip side of that for expanding the electorate. Election day registration went from 6 to 21. And Ohio is not on that list, but online voter registration went from 0 in 2000 to 40 in 2020, and Ohio is on that list. So Ohio has done actually amazingly well during this period, expanding despite Republican state legislature control, and with some mixed results though when it comes to the voter ID laws. Here's a map that just kind of gives you a sense of where these battle lines are drawn. It's a little bit like the red and blue map that we see on election nights on all the news channels, but it's not an exact matchup. Gray are mixed. Orange are states with greater restrictions, and green are states with a mostly unmixed record of expanded access. So the arc of history is not maybe as clearly one for making it tougher to vote than one might at first imagine just reading the news. And furthermore, the myth that the Democrats do best as turnout is higher is clearly flawed and wildly inaccurate, most likely. This is a pretty new book by two political scientists, Darren Shaw and John Petrosic, making the case empirically that the myth that Democrats benefit from high turnout is a flawed myth. And it's a great book. I recommend it to everybody. One of the sort of very basic points that they make is that the midterm loss phenomenon isn't a phenomenon that only seems to plague Democratic presidents. It plagues Republican presidents too. This would be relevant, during the Obama years. It looked like this was a big problem, and maybe even during the Clinton years, it looked like this was a big problem, or at least some of the Clinton years. You have high turnout in presidential elections, you expand your congressional majority, you win the presidency, and then turnout drops in the midterm, and you lose a bunch of seats in the Congress, maybe even lose your congressional majority. It's probably going to happen next year in the upcoming midterm elections. But it turns out that a lot of that is just sort of a basic electoral gravity. And it doesn't matter which party won the presidency, they're going to lose some seats in the subsequent midterm election because the president's not on the ballot anymore. You did exceptionally well in the presidential election in your congressional races because the president was there. Take the president out of the equation, you're going to do a little bit worse. Gravity is going to pull that down, not the turnout myth. In the wake of the most recent election on Tuesday, New York Times ran this story about the turnout myth. I was gratified to see this because I think that the press really buys into this turnout myth and bears a significant responsibility for spreading it within conventional wisdom. But looking in Virginia, interestingly, that was a state led by the Democrats, and they had really expanded access in the electorate in advance of this 2021 gubernatorial election. But the Democrat lost there. And so, this is maybe the exception that proves the rule, with the rule being that the conventional wisdom is wrong. But this is another interesting way of looking at the ways in which this conventional wisdom that one party benefits especially from a high turnout is flawed. It seems to be, maybe nominally the case that whichever party is in the minority in the electorate probably does better in lower turnout elections. But even that, because the rate of turnout is so low, isn't necessarily an ironclad rule. And it's certainly the case that the parties are sort of closer and closer in terms of their mass adherence over time. And so it's also not as clear as it was, say, during the New Deal era, that the Democrats have a numerical advantage in the electorate like they once did. And last but not least, it's always useful, I think, to look back on the arc of history because this is not a new front in political battles. Here we have a picture of Strom Thurmond, notorious for having the longest filibuster ever. And this was an actual, like, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington kind of filibuster where he stood up there and talked for a long time, 24 hours and 18 minutes, a physically daunting feat. He was filibustering the Civil Rights Act of '57, which isn't exactly like a voter, it wasn't the Voting Rights Act. And he was a Democrat at the time, it bears mentioning, although by the time the Voting Rights Act passed, he was a Republican. But transition to modern times, we've got Mitch McConnell and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. This is a new Republican filibuster. It's sort of in a new style, though. There are some actual filibusters that still happen on the Senate floor, but more often than not, it's sort of out with Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and in with quick failed cloture votes. Cloture is, of course, the actual rule in the Senate, not there isn't like a filibuster rule, but the actual rule is the number of votes required to end debate. And so that stands at 60. And the coalition behind the new Voting Rights Act was not able to reach that sort of supermajority status. So like I said, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I'm not sure if that makes us more or less optimistic, but in any case, I'm going to wrap up here, and sort of I'm covering some of the legislative angles of election administration, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Jonathan to talk about some of the judicial politics connections here. When we were setting things up, I said that I would end by saying that sort of the harder we work on improving elections, because we've spent more and done more legislative stuff on election administration in the wake of the 2000 election than I think ever before in history. But despite working harder to improve elections, we're getting more legal challenges. And Jonathan said, well, boy, I'm not sure that's true, which is exactly what any good scholar should say after any theoretically empirical statement. So I did find this graph finally that shows the number of post-election challenges over time. And it's a fairly steady increase. I had a hard time finding the graph and almost substituted in the COVID case graph as a little end of presentation joke. But in any case, I will turn it over then at this point because judicial politics is obviously of increasing importance here.
Okay, thank you, Ryan, and thank you to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland for inviting me to speak with you again. Now I'm going to share my screen here in just a moment. All right. Okay. Now I'm honored to be back with UUCC. I was here with you, I think, just about a year ago, right before the presidential election, to talk a little bit about some of the legal issues that might have arisen at that time. So let me pick up where Ryan left off, and let me emphasize that I'm really primarily a law professor, and that's why I'm going to focus on more legal issues. I'm going to paint in broad strokes, but I'm happy to get into more detail during the discussion. Now, let me start by talking a little bit about what the Constitution says about voting. And the most important thing about the Constitution is that it doesn't really guarantee the right to vote at all. In presidential elections, the members of the Electoral College are selected in such manner as the legislature may direct. This could mean, for example, that a state legislature could unilaterally assign the state's electoral votes to a candidate without allowing the people to vote at all. Or, more plausibly these days, it could mean that the state legislature, after the fact, could assign the state's electoral votes to a candidate who did not prevail in the popular vote in that state. Now, in congressional elections, the voters who get to vote are those who are qualified to choose members of the most numerous branch of the state legislature, right? The lower house in every state except Nebraska. But notice that the right to vote for members of Congress is not a matter of federal law, it's a matter of state law, because the state decides who gets to vote for the most numerous branch in the state legislature. Now, the Constitution does impose some restrictions on what states can do. So, for example, the 15th Amendment prohibits racial discrimination in allowing the right to vote. The 19th Amendment prohibits sex discrimination. The 24th Amendment outlaws poll taxes as a prerequisite for voting. And the 26th Amendment sets a minimum voting age of 18. Now, there isn't a lot of law about any of these provisions other than the 15th Amendment. And there are a couple of key developments here. One is the white primary cases. And the key case here was in 1944. Basically, what happened was in a lot of states in the South, where the only election that really mattered was the Democratic primary, because there was hardly any Republican Party in the South. A number of places wouldn't allow African Americans to vote, and the Supreme Court chipped away at the white primary. And as I said, the 1944 case of Smith against Allwright, that's probably the most significant of those. The other big 15th Amendment case that I like is the Tuskegee gerrymandering case, Gamillion against Lightfoot. And here is the map. The outside of this map, the square, that's what the Tuskegee city limits used to look like. And then the Alabama legislature decided in its wisdom to redraw the city limits from this square to what the Supreme Court described as an uncouth 28-sided figure. It's this thing in here. And just for the record, this is the campus of Tuskegee, what was then Tuskegee Institute, and you'll see it was no longer in the city. Now, what happened here? The legislature, in redrawing the boundaries this way, removed 99% of the Black voters from the city of Tuskegee, even though Black voters often had enough clout to be able to decide elections, local elections, when the white voters, who were the overwhelming majority of those allowed to vote, when they split. So virtually every single Black voter was removed from the city limits. Not a single white voter was removed from the city limits. And the Supreme Court didn't have much trouble saying this is blatantly unconstitutional. They can't do that.
About our elections.
Now, fast forward a few years, we get the Voting Rights Act, which Ryan has referred to. There are two key provisions of the Voting Rights Act.
that affects us
Okay.
politically.
There seems to be some feedback coming in. So if there's, let me just encourage people to make sure they're muted. Okay, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act prohibits racially discriminatory voting rules, and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act required that certain covered jurisdictions who were defined by a formula elsewhere in the statute, that certain covered jurisdictions with a history of discriminatory voting rules would have to
Thank you
get
very
federal
much.
pre-clearance to change their
Important
rules,
information.
advance approval to
Currently
change their
historic.
rules.
Legally,
Now, recently, however, the Supreme Court has been cutting back on the scope of the Voting Rights Act. Two key cases, one in 2013, Shelby County against Holder, the court invalidated the formula, the coverage formula in Section 4B. The court explained that this was the same formula that Congress had enacted in 1965, had not updated it, and so the world looked somewhat different half a century later, and it was unconstitutional to keep the same formula in hand. Now, that's not a great ruling because it at least left open the possibility that Congress could update the formula, which it has not done. So as a practical matter, pre-clearance is a dead letter at this point. And then just this past July, in a case called Brnovich against the Democratic National Committee, the court made it a lot more difficult to win Section 2 cases. So it's now more difficult for Voting Rights Act claims to win. Now, we'll come back to this, but there's another set of legal issues to think about, and that has to do with districting, which both Ryan and Susan have referred to. Now, this is, of course, timely for folks here because Ohio is in the process of redrawing its legislative and congressional districts. Here are a few basic principles. Number one, districts have to have equal population. That's the one person, one vote principle. We can get into the weeds about how close the population of each district has to be, what population counts for these purposes, but the basic rule, as I said, is one person, one vote, and substantially equal population. Now, in theory, districts are also supposed to be contiguous and compact, but there are not really detailed legal rules for defining what that means. Second point, and this is also from Gamillion against Lightfoot, racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional. Gamillion was actually a pretty easy case. Let me get back here. Because the legislature operated with such precision that you really couldn't see any plausible explanation for why these lines were drawn, except that the state was trying to eliminate Blacks from voting in Tuskegee. But there are other cases in which the Supreme Court has said that's an unconstitutional racial gerrymander, but the court has had trouble coming up with a consistent definition. Indeed, I think if you're not overly cynical, you might say that the court's definition of a racial gerrymandering is, we know it when we see it, to paraphrase a statement by Justice Potter Stewart in an obscenity case that arose in Cleveland Heights more than 60 years ago. Okay. The third basic principle, partisan gerrymandering. The Supreme Court in 2019, in a case called Rucho against Common Cause, said federal courts cannot hear cases involving allegations of partisan gerrymandering. that's a pretty big rule because most gerrymanders at bottom really are partisan gerrymanders. Whoever is in control of the process, whichever party is in control of the process, tends to want to maximize its advantages. Now, we can see a partisan gerrymander in just the current Ohio congressional map. We can see the Marcy Kaptur's snake on the lake that runs from the west side of Cleveland along Lake Erie and all the way out to Toledo. And then there's Jim Jordan's Duck District, the 4th district, that starts out over near Dayton, a little north and east of Dayton, and weaves its way all the way over into Lorain County. Now, Rucho, the case I was just talking about, is consistent with a pattern of voting and election cases in recent years, notably cases involving changes to voting procedures because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, for example, in April of 2020, the Supreme Court overturned a lower court order that extended the deadline for returning and counting mail-in ballots in the Wisconsin primary. The court invoked its so-called Purcell rule that federal courts should not require changes in voting too close to the election, lest the people be confused and maybe not be able to vote at all. Now, if we take Rucho and the Purcell principle at face value, that suggests that we shouldn't be expecting courts to do a lot of heavy lifting on election reform. But it does suggest that we could reform the districting process through other mechanisms like citizen initiatives or state constitutional amendments. The Supreme Court a few years ago upheld the constitutionality of Arizona's independent redistricting commission. And a number of other states have gone down that path. But we might note that this is not a foolproof system. In fact, this year, the Arizona Redistricting Commission has fallen into intense partisan squabbling, and they may not be able to come up with a new map through this reform process. And we've seen similar problems arise in other states that have reformed their districting process. Virginia is one example, New York State is another, and then there's Missouri, which in 2018 enacted a reform measure. And before the state even had a chance to use it, opponents managed to get the voters in 2020 to repeal the reform. As you probably know, we have in Ohio, we have recently amended the state constitution to come up with a new mechanism for drawing legislative and congressional district boundaries. Well, this is the first time around for those mechanisms, and we've already seen that the system for state legislative districts hasn't worked very well. There are now 3 cases pending in the Ohio Supreme Court challenging the map that the Ohio Redistricting Commission came up with. We don't yet have the official map for the congressional districts. We've got some proposals out there, but the process hasn't worked according to the way it was designed to work so far. And I think we can expect to see more litigation over the congressional maps once once they're formally adopted. Now, and finally, let me just say a little bit about election administration, because those are issues that we're going to have to deal with. Now, a few states, notably Georgia, but some others, have enacted laws this year that reduce the role of the Secretary of State in election administration and empower the legislature to exercise significant control instead. Now, let's be clear. Secretaries of State are partisan officials and they are elected. But as a group, Secretaries of State work under a norm of more or less impartial administration. Some Secretaries of State adhere to that norm more conscientiously than others do. But compared to state legislatures, Secretaries of State are a lot more compliant with that norm than we should, than we have reason to think legislators will. Other countries, Ryan referred to the fact that Americans vote for a lot more things than people in other countries do, and a lot more often. Other countries also entrust election administration to nonpartisan civil service type people, not elected officials, and that has some bearing on how elections run in those places. Now, maybe that it would be a good idea to follow that model in the United States, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. As I said, Secretaries of State do seem more reliable as a group than legislators. Now, what does all this mean? We shouldn't expect courts to serve as a check on abusive election administration. Now, I'm not talking about the kinds of bizarre legal theories that we saw brought on behalf of President Trump in the 2020 presidential election, where the plaintiffs claimed that election officials either tolerated or perpetrated election fraud. The new measures that we have seen, they do change the process of election administration to some extent, and that implicates the right to vote. But, as I said at the beginning, the Constitution provides only limited protection for voting rights. It seems unlikely that federal courts are going to block some of these newer measures, because even though they may have a kind of a partisan skew, or they may have a kind of disparate impact on voters of color, these rules, these laws are written in neutral terms. And the legal tests that the Supreme Court has endorsed for finding violation of voting rights will make it difficult for those claims to win. And even then, those claims have to be couched in terms of racial discrimination. If the argument is, well, these voting rules may provide a partisan advantage, the partisan gerrymandering cases suggest that, well, that's going to be an uphill battle. Now, more than a century ago, the legendary Mr. Dooley observed that politics ain't beanbag. That's still true. And it strikes me that the reason that we're having these sorts of legal discussions is because we are badly divided as a people about how to deal with these issues. And so the law might be able to help to some extent, but in the end, the fault is not in our stars, but ourselves. Thanks.
So I think we're about to enter into the question and answer period. If you want to be on our email list, put your email address in the chat box, but for question and answers, use the Q&A button. And if you want to raise your hand and actually speak and be heard, you can do that too. And we're going to use both methods for getting questions. So our two question assistants are Laura Imbernoni and Debbie Wright, who is labeled Fellowship Hall, but it's really Debbie Wright.
Hello, and thank you so much. That was very, very interesting and timely. We have quite a few questions from one of our participants, and I'm going to read a little group that kind of go together from this participant. She says, please ask Brian to define mass adherence. Ask him to comment on the 1825-1925 peak of voting, which seemed to appear at the same time as religious revivalism. And finally, ask him to discuss the fact that angry voters show up for elections, and those who aren't angry are less likely to. And this person says the fact that Republicans seem to be more angry than Democrats, and does that mean they're going to show up a little bit more?
Well, those are all really interesting questions. Let's see here. So the first one sort of had to do with that initial trend that I showed, sort of the long arc of history and participation in presidential elections. And yeah, so the point that I was making about sort of the rise in participation, I think is one that Jonathan made pretty nicely, maybe more nicely than I did, but that initially the presidential election wasn't really tied to the mass vote at all. State legislatures basically made the decision for each state how to apportion the electors. It wasn't universally true, I think, even from the first couple of elections. Maybe in the first couple of elections, but anyways, fairly. There was basically a longitudinal increase though after the first presidential election, where state legislatures began connecting the mass vote through statute to the way that the electoral college vote for that state would be apportioned. And so I think that, one of the things that you see in the arc of increasing participation in presidential elections was just that trend. And then Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams duked it out in a couple of presidential elections. John Quincy Adams was victorious in their first contest, and Jackson and the Democratic Party kind of went back and tried to think about how to win in the second contest. And actually, I should also mention that the first contest was it was not easy to determine sort of who actually won that contest. So that one got hung up, and it was even, I think, harder to sort things out than our 2000 election more recently was.
Well, I think let's be clear. That election went to the House of Representatives because nobody got a majority in the Electoral College. And in the end, even though Jackson had a plurality of the popular vote, Adams wound up with a winning in the House because Henry Clay, who was one of the other candidates, through his support to Adams, Jackson was furious, claimed this was a corrupt bargain, and used that as a big issue the next time around to defeat Adams.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, and so you get sort of expansion of the franchise because Jackson thought that a bigger electorate would favor him more, and a lot of efforts to expand, make it easier to vote in a lot of different ways. And I'm not entirely sure how religious revival has whether there's a real strong correlation earlier in the history. My work on religion and politics is much more recent in terms of looking at the history, sort of after the more recent rise of the Christian right. So I think, it probably there's some interesting ideas there. The last thing that was mentioned was sort of this idea that negative emotion is more motivating than positive emotion, and there's certainly a lot of psychological evidence that is the case. I might push back just a little bit though on the idea that one side is more angry than the other side. One of the in the wake of a lot of effort over several elections in Georgia in particular to I don't know, either fight fraud, depending on how you want to characterize things, or make it harder to vote. One of the theories about why turnout increased nevertheless is this idea that there was a backlash against the the effort to restrict and make it more difficult to vote. And so I think it can cut both ways. Some of my research has indicated that in terms of the way individuals process this kind of political information, both sides are super motivated by their partisanship, and that's I don't know. I keep thinking that I need to write a book that would have some kind of a title like "You're Just Like Me and I Hate You" or something like that. Because when you survey people and sort of subject them to various experimental manipulations, giving scenarios about unethical election behavior, each side is willing to overlook unethical behavior by their own, and each side is super willing to punish unethical behavior by the other side. And it's almost like completely symmetrical. Like, Democrats do that just as much as Republicans do when we survey people and put hypothetical scenarios in front of them.
So
before Debbie asks the next question, I want to remind everybody that you can ask your question directly if you just go to the raise your hand icon, you can click on that and be recognized to answer a question. And then also you can go to the Q&A icon on your device, click on that and type in a question. And Debbie, you got a question?
I do. This asks the question about the courts. The person's confused. I'm confused. Courts can't do the heavy lifting, yet there are many cases, and there will be many more, going before the courts about election results. Please explain this cognitive dissonance.
Well, I think that there are different kinds of election-related cases that will go before courts. I was focused less on, say, election contests after the fact, where people are saying, or losing candidates are saying, that the results, the announced results, are inaccurate in some way. Either they were miscounted, or maybe they were fraudulent votes or whatever. There is a pretty well-established system for courts to resolve election-related challenges of that kind. But the kinds of voting issues that we're talking about now, that have been controversial, things about how much, if any, early voting will be allowed, what, if any, sort of voter ID requirements will be allowed. Those are about basic ground rules for the conduct of elections. The Voting Rights Act was passed at a time when there were blatantly race-based rules that said, in effect, Black people can't vote, or Black people will have a way harder time voting than white people will have. I mean, that's part of the idea that we saw in Tuskegee, where you try to take all the Black voters out of the jurisdiction. And in those areas, although the Voting Rights Act could be read broadly, expansively to address those sorts of issues, courts have tended, the Supreme Court in recent years especially, has interpreted the Voting Rights Act in a sufficiently narrow way that it is difficult to win those cases. I don't mean to say you can't win them at all, but you will have a much harder time winning cases under the Voting Rights Act because of the way the Supreme Court has interpreted its language. The Voting Rights Act was designed to, in effect, to be an action-forcing, preemptive measure to say, we have a big problem here, and Congress is now setting up some ground rules to make it clear that we're going to address that problem. But the recent cases have said, well, it's not that big a deal. The country is in a very different place now than it was in 1965. So we're going to presume that the election process is functioning in an acceptable way. We're going to make it a lot harder for cases brought under the Voting Rights Act to succeed.
Some would say that the restrictions on voting that a number of states have been able to design do have racial elements. And so a question we could ask is that still a factor that these sorts of restrictions keep certain cultural elements, African Americans, Latinos, from voting as freely as others?
I think that's a really important question. By the way, the Brnovich case that I talked about from July, the folks who were most disadvantaged by the rules in Arizona were actually members of the Navajo Nation and other Native American communities, and their claims fail. Now, I don't mean to say that we don't have a problem. What I'm saying is that cases like Gamillion against Lightfoot are easy because the racial aspect is right there. I mean, it is impossible to see any other plausible explanation for how the Tuskegee city limits got redrawn the way they did. But if you have a set of rules that say you need only one of a small number of identification documents in order to be able to vote, well, yes, that may well have a disproportionate impact on Blacks or Latinos or what have you. But the restrictions are written in neutral terms. And so the question is, how aggressively will courts look beyond the neutral language? There was a time when courts were more willing to look behind neutral language than is true today. The problem today is that the Supreme Court doesn't, or a majority of the Supreme Court doesn't seem willing or interested in exploring the real world impact. The majority of the court, I think, kind of agrees with Mr. Dooley that politics ain't beanbag, and so a certain amount of gamesmanship is inevitable, and the court doesn't seem interested in trying to go too far behind the surface on these.
So I have a question. We've talked a lot about laws and rules to keep people from voting. And I know that's your area of expertise, but why don't people vote? I mean, when I look at how much energy is put into getting out the vote, and you look at the Cleveland results with the mayor election of what was it, 16 or 23% of people turned out to vote for that local election. Why don't people vote? Do you all look at any of those questions beyond the laws and the barriers that are put up?
Well, there's an interesting obituary. Just recently, Anthony Downs, who was an economist who made his mark in the 1950s with a wonderful book on the economics of democracy, and Downs said something that I think a lot of people have come to agree with, that it may be rational not to vote because the outcome of the election may have great symbolic significance, but it might not have a huge real world impact, and it might not be worth your time and energy to try to figure out whom to vote for, or and even if you have a preference, you might not be very optimistic that the election will actually lead to any significant change.
Do you have an opinion on this, Ryan?
Yeah, well, when we teach it in American politics, we always talk about Downs's work. And that's the economic model of elections is great. It was a great work. I think it was his dissertation, almost unedited, and it became an instant classic that we still talk about today. Something that all of us who ever wrote a dissertation envy. And so, the thing about that sort of line of work is often caught up within a bigger way of thinking about behavior that that social scientists borrowed from economists called rational choice theory, and applied to a variety of different questions. You can think about what the rational choice would be. The key is people thought about like an equation that would describe the decision-making calculus a voter might go through. Has always been that the electorate is big, and so the likelihood that your vote is the vote that would determine which candidate won is exceedingly small, like, smaller than winning the lottery. Way smaller than winning the lottery in a presidential election. That's also complicated by the Electoral College and different states and all this stuff.
Well, do you think if we had ranked choice voting where more minority views could be heard and then minority views could cooperate to get some of the other, their voices heard, would that make a difference? Because this polarity of Democrats, Republicans, I can see where your single voice gets lost in the process.
It could, although in some ways I think it can be thought of as being a complicated system too. So what the thing about rational choice is that it's almost always incorrect. It predicts that nobody's going to vote, but lots of people vote. And so in terms of a way of thinking about behavior, the absolute theoretical prediction is a lot less interesting than some of the nuances that you get along the way. And so if you think about the decision to vote as being like an economic decision that people make, then you think about all the different things that structure voting, like that sticker that they give you on the way out. It turns out that that's super important to people. And the reason that secretaries of state give you that sticker is because now you can go out and you've got it on your shirt and you've got bragging rights. And it turns out that that's maybe the most valuable part of the whole day for you, is that symbolic expression of your having done your civic duty. So, yeah.
It looks like we might have a question from a participant at Fellowship Hall.
Hi, I'm Carol Yu. Thank you for being here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
My question is out of not much research about it, but just having interest in, I don't understand the criteria used for redistribution, where when you look at let's just take Ohio. And I don't know if it's different state to state or if it's the same, but when you just look at the map, it kind of, begs you to question like that, the snaking and everything when the map is, it's just like, that doesn't seem right. And I understand what you're saying that, to bring it to court and to actually, show the racial divide or something like that, or the partisan divide is getting harder. But my question is more, what is the criteria to redistribute, to make those snake lines? Because I know that they weren't always like that.
Well, okay. The basic criterion is population.
So census.
Every district is supposed to have essentially the same number of people in it. That's the one person, one vote principle. The Supreme Court, and that's what the Supreme Court has been saying for 60 odd years. Now, there is this kind of aspirational idea that the district should be compact and contiguous, but there's, at least under the federal Constitution, we don't have any real rules about that. And so what's happened is that every 10 years after the census, people sit down with maps and they try to draw lines that create districts that have just about the same number of people in them, because that's the federal constitutional rule. But the people who draw those maps are elected officials for the most part, who are members of political parties, and both parties have an interest in maximizing or trying to maximize the number of seats they can get. That's how we get the Snake on the Lake, the Duck, and lots of other districts of that sort. And it is districts like that that led some states like Arizona to go for independent redistricting commissions. and other states like Ohio to go for a somewhat different system that was designed to make it more likely that there would be a kind of bipartisan agreement that this map might not be perfect for either the Republicans or the Democrats, but it's good enough for both of them. But we've seen in Ohio that it's possible to game that system. We'll see how much they can game it, because the validity of the General Assembly maps, that's now in the Ohio Supreme Court, which has authority under Ohio law to approve or disapprove the maps if they're challenged. But this is pretty much a question of partisan interest. The person who,
Power.
the people with power are going to exercise it. And I think that's kind of what's happening. Now, yes, there are other ways that we could have voting. There was, discussion about ranked choice, proportional representation. There's a whole lot of those mechanisms. But as Ryan says, those mechanisms are more complicated than our current system. And so where ranked choice voting has been tried, some folks have found it just overwhelming because they find it more complicated, and some people just kind of throw up their hands. But there's, we also have a system that requires single member districts for Congress and for state legislatures. That's not in the Constitution. We could change that, and there are some things we could do that wouldn't eliminate partisan gamesmanship in line drawing, but might make it possible to get less gamesmanship. Similarly, if we try to draw the district lines in a way that promoted or partisan competition, right, that might have some influence on internal party dynamics. If you have a whole bunch of safe seats, the Republicans don't have to worry about losing to the Democrats in the general election. The Democrats don't have to worry about losing to the Republicans in the general election. But everybody has to worry about getting a primary challenge from somebody who says you're not sufficiently committed to the most, to the hardcore extreme party position. That tends to drive people apart. If it were possible, and I will defer to Ryan on this because I don't know the answer, but to the extent that it might be possible to draw more competitive districts, that might have a lot of benefits for us as well. But even if it were possible to do that, the question is, which party has the incentive to do this? Both the Republicans and the Democrats in Ohio had chances to go for reforming the districting process, and they both rejected it because they both wanted a chance to draw the map on their own.
Jonathan and Ryan, thank you both. I think it's time to turn this back over to Susan, and thank you all who asked questions.
We missed one hand raised, but I apologize for not getting that in. Hopefully the question was also submitted in the Q&A button from EOJB. Susan, do you have some closing remarks?
Yes, I appreciate that. Thank you, Wayne. I want to thank both of our speakers and the audience for a wonderful discussion here, very informative in terms of historical information, present information, legal information. We certainly appreciate all of that discussion on our elections. I want everyone to know this forum has been recorded, and it will soon be available on our congregation website, uucleveland.org, in the forums section. And I do want to talk about our forum in 2 weeks from today. We're not having a forum next week, but in 2 weeks, it'll be, which is November 21st. The title is Social Media, the Internet and Technology, Monopolies versus Accountability. We'll be discussing the enormous power and impact of Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and how they've been immune to antitrust laws and FTC investigations. And our speaker is Ryan Adamson, a Case Western Reserve University law professor.
I do want to add one thing, Susan. We
Sure.
don't have a forum next week, but we do have a discussion on bail reform next week.
That's right.
It's going to be 9:30. The link can be found on the website in our weekly update, our news section. If you're not, and then we may be sending it out to all our forum announcement group, but it'll be a
Absolutely.
film on cash bail reform.
Right. And that also leads me into the topic for our sermon this morning at 11 o'clock. Reverend Randy Partain is going to also be talking. His title is With Liberty and Justice for All, and it's also on bail reform and what Debbie was just talking about. This morning at 11 o'clock, we're meeting inside our sanctuary, and all of the pews are clearly marked for social distancing. We do require mask wearing. And if you can't join us in person, you can always go to our Unitarian website, uucleveland.org, and click on the YouTube icon up in the upper right-hand part of the website. So again, we want to thank you for your continued support of our audience, and look forward to seeing you 2 weeks from today. And our forum topic again, we are going to be on the top 5 technology monopolies and their impact on our lives, economically, socially, and beyond. And again, we want to thank our speakers and our audience, and we look forward to joining you 2 weeks from today. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.